The first question is, what area of your scholarship on political repression helps us understand what is happening now? So sorry, just to repeat, she will lead off and then the others will join in, and we'll sort of do a rotation of this for all three questions. So Ellen, you are on.
It's pretty obvious that my expertise in McCarthyism is relevant today. And in fact, every time since I've written for the past 40 years or so, whenever political repression rears its ugly head in this country, I'm besieged by calls from other scholars, journalists, all asking, how does this moment compare to McCarthyism? And usually I sort of say, well, it depends on the situation. Today, I can say what's happening today is much, much, much worse than whatever happened during the McCarthy period, which was pretty bad. But it was mainly focused on sanctioning individual, quote unquote, communists in accordance with a highly demonized notion of communism that spread, essentially attacked much of the American old left. And certainly its impact was to move the American political culture spectrum to the right. Today, the Trump-Musk regime is attacking the entire government. And so its impact on the rest of society is much, much greater than that of McCarthyism. But there are a lot of similarities, both, for example, of those episodes, McCarthyism and today, are assaulting our political freedom with the rationalizing it by defending against some kind of highly demonized enemy, an internal enemy, perhaps, the supposed red menace during the McCarthy period. And today it's kind of woke, quote unquote, woke culture and so-called anti-Semitism, which is really simply criticism of what Israel's doing today. But unlike political repression in many other societies, there's little violence or, at this point, criminal sanctions. Most of the sanctions are economic, and they're carried out by employers, both within the public and private sectors. And so the lesson that we most need to learn from the 1950s is that the central role of mainstream institutions within American society, like universities, like local governments, like movie studios, like whatever private employer, are collaborating with the repression by justifying it, by legitimizing it, and by not fighting back. And so they are facilitating that repression, and they're doing this today. It's been ongoing in many parts of American society for years, decades, in fact, but no pushback of any kind that is valuable. And so what we're seeing, of course, is people censoring and self-censoring. I'm going to give you just one example of how that pushback occurred during McCarthyism, and then let's talk about pushback and not pushback, perhaps. There's an organization known as the AAU, or American Association of Universities. Very few people have heard of it, but it's rather powerful within the academic world, because its 71 members are the presidents of the main research universities in the United States. In other words, the brand name universities we all know of. And when, during the 1950s, it was founded in 1900, I think. During the 1950s, as McCarthyism targeted the universities, the leaders of the AAUP felt that there was a need for an overall general statement to deal with those professors who had once been in or near the party and were being called up by congressional committees. And many of them were going to take the Fifth Amendment to refuse to cooperate with the committees. And the only way you could do that was to take the Fifth Amendment, which essentially says you can remain silent if you're in danger of being prosecuted. And so, what these people did in the AAU was devise a formula telling faculty members who might be called up that they had an obligation to protect their university's reputation, and they had, and I'm going to read this. Above all, he owes his colleagues in the university complete candor and perfect integrity. What does candor mean? It means answering all of the committee's questions, including those of other people. And people who didn't want to be prosecuted for candor, but didn't want to be informers, took the Fifth. And they had, according to the AAU, a duty as a professor to speak out. Refusal to do so, on whatever legal grounds, cannot fail to reflect upon a profession that claims for itself the fullest freedom to speak and the maximum protection of that freedom available in our society. In this respect, invocation of the Fifth Amendment places upon a professor a heavy burden of proof of his fitness to hold a teaching position and lays upon his university an obligation to re-examine its qualifications for membership in its society. So what they're saying is, you take the Fifth Amendment and we'll fire you. This was collaboration in the most dreadful manner, and no wonder that professors were silenced.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. That was a great way to start off this discussion. And I'm not sure if David or Robin would like to jump in next.
Oh, I'll jump in. Yeah,
Okay.
and I'll give you the 60-second version. Basically, I spent the last 40 years writing about working class movements, usually, but not always, anti-capitalist, multiracial, often Black-led, and anti-fascist. And by fascist, I mean not just the classical fascism, but the kind of longue durée of fascism, which had its roots in the United States. So in the South, of course, the South functioned as a fascist regime, under what was considered the most liberal administration in history, the Roosevelt New Deal era. And of course, Ira Katznelson wrote about this. But the point I want to make, this is tied to the question of complicity, is tied to the question of collaboration. That is, there's no way that that the kind of repression would have worked without a certain level of white working class complicity or complacency. The level of repression would have been unsustainable. The same thing with patriarchy and with ableism. So I just want to mention that we sometimes sleep on the kind of quote unquote friendly fascism, the kind of soft authoritarianism rooted in white nationalism, patriotism, xenophobia, patriarchy, law and order discourse, personal responsibility, that whole idea against dependency, entitlements, welfare, anything beginning with the word public, right? And so forth. It recruits a portion of white working people, specifically cisgender, heterosexual white working people, to defend in the name of freedom and civilization against the other, right? And in doing so, they promote the expansion of a carceral state, limits on civil liberties, join the kind of ruling class attack on the social wage, with in other words, things that they need. So this is what we're up against sometimes. That is, what is the investment of certain people in this system when they actually don't benefit?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. David?
Here, I'm not a historian. I'm a lawyer. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I've been a law professor for a very long time. And I've done civil liberties and civil rights law for my entire career, about 40 years. Most recently with the ACLU, I started about 10 days before Trump took office the first time around as the national legal director of the ACLU. So I've litigated a lot of these issues in a variety of contexts, and I've also written about them. I wrote a book called Enemy Aliens, Double Standards and Constitutional Freedoms in the War on Terrorism. I wrote another book called Engines of Liberty, How Citizen Activists Make Constitutional Law. Another book called Less Safe, Less Free, which was about the preemptive paradigm and how it undermines not only our freedoms, but ultimately our safety. And so in working on those books and in my litigation, I've really been focused on situations where the government faces some kind of external threat, or at least perceived external threat, a national security crisis. And in response to that national security crisis, comes down hard, uses broad authorities, often initially against immigrants, often on the argument that, well, they don't have the same rights as we do, but then they expand those authorities more broadly. And what strikes me about this moment that is so different from all of the other moments, I think, in our history where we have seen the executive branch overreach, is that the others all actually had some national security threat at their, inception. So it was, it was World War I, or it was the Palmer raids, which were a response to a series of terrorist bombings, or World War II, the Japanese internment, in response to the war in a country that's fighting us, and killing many of our people. The Cold War and McCarthyism, the Communist Party, which was certainly seen as an external threat. The War on Terror, which was in response to the bombing of the or not the bombing, but the taking down of the Twin Towers and flying the plane into the Pentagon. I mean, these are serious threats, and there was overreaction. What's remarkable here is there's no threat. There's no serious threat. Trump sometimes talks about the border as an invasion, but that's kind of laughable. It's not a national security threat in any serious way. And about maybe 10% of what he is doing, even conceivably, connects to the border, and a huge amount of it is essentially not about national security, not about war, but about a culture war. And that is, to me, deeply troubling. That these kinds of it's one thing when you use these extraordinary measures in response to something that, at least in people think, imperils the nation. Here, he's using it in context where there is nothing that is imperiling the nation. He is imperiling the nation.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to go on to the second question. And the second question is, are there good examples of how to effectively resist authoritarianism and repression from either U.S. history or from other parts of the world? And David, you're going to lead off on this one.
Yeah. So there are so many examples, right? I mean, you could start with Louis Post, who was the acting Secretary of Labor during the Palmer raids at a time when the Labor Department reviewed deportations, and he personally stepped in and overturned over 1,000 deportation orders coming out of the Palmer raids. He was brought up on impeachment charges or impeachment inquiry for doing so, but he stood up, pushed back, saved a lot of people, and was a hero. You could look at the university professors. Ellen was talking about the university professors. Many of them did go to the committee and asserted their Fifth Amendment rights. Some of them asserted their First Amendment rights and were willing to go to jail to stand up and push back, and ultimately built enough resistance that we were able to turn that thing around. You look at the civil rights protesters and the people who engage in sit-ins and other forms of civil disobedience, who went down to the South and risked their lives to fight for justice, which they ultimately achieved in, not in full, but in significant measures. And then the last example I'll give is the most recent one I wrote about in Engines of Liberty, was the response to Bush in the war on terror. You know, Bush, when after 9/11, Bush had about an 85% approval rating. 85% approval, huge approval rating. He engaged in a really broad range of security measures, from torture to disappearances into black sites to warrantless collection of cell phone data on every American, to holding people at Guantanamo. But people pushed back. Civil society organizations pushed back using international forums, using US forums, using the press, bringing in people like former generals to speak out against the torture. And by the time Bush left office, he had closed the black sites, he had stopped the torture, he had released over 500 people of the 750 who were held at Guantanamo. Bush released more people from Guantanamo than anyone else in response to this pressure, and had ended that warrantless collection of cell. So resistance, is there evidence of it? Absolutely. Does it work? Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Ellen, do you want to respond to this?
I wish I was as positive as David has been. I'm not, I'm seeing such a collapse in, and fear, because what's happening is so unprecedented. And I think we're not really ready to deal. What college presidents, for example, are doing is just being quiet. You know, the AAU still exists, 71 members, and none of them, I think, have spoken out directly. There's one college president, one, well, really two. One runs a small Catholic girls' college in Washington, D.C., and the other is the president of Wesleyan, which has a hefty endowment and does not do as much research as the scientific research as maybe other schools do, who are so seriously threatened. I mean, the threat is so enormous to take away the to impose a tiny cap on the funding for overhead costs, which has been shown to lose money anyhow for research grants in major universities. It cuts away the main funding of these organizations that have been struggling for money ever since the 60s, mind you, because there was a pullback in state funding after the 60s, in response to the 60s, that has never been restored. So what we're seeing actually is sort of the culmination of a major war against higher education. But it's also a major war against whatever racial progress has been made since 1954, you know, since Brown versus Board of Education. What we're seeing is just such a massive attack on civil society in the United States at this moment, that to think how much depends on Amy Coney Barrett, for example, to keep the Constitution alive is terrifying. So would say that what we need is people who are willing to take risks and to engage in collective action, give up sort of our internal silos, move out, protest, begin to do civil disobedience, and perhaps, you know, bring certain activities of ordinary life to a halt in order to get that public sentiment to move the American people.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
Yes, yes, Ellen, I totally agree. on all that. And to David's point, it's true. Bush released more, but then he also put more people in Guantanamo than any other president. So, it's like 6 on one, half a dozen the other. So let me say a couple things. I mean, I think David gave a great overview of some really good examples. I'm less interested in specific examples because they always have to be understood in context, and they can't always be applicable to our moment. But I want to just raise 2 things. One has to do with the danger of appeasement. We cannot, historically and in the current moment, we cannot wait until an authoritarian regime is upon us to resist it. The most effective resistance historically to repressive and reactionary policies have been against liberal regimes. In other words, consider the free speech movement, for example, growing out of the opposition to the speaker ban. Or, think about the most militant anti-war and anti-police protests occurred during the Johnson administration and its so-called Great Society, because keep in mind, it was Johnson that expanded and escalated the Vietnam War, expanded and escalated all sorts of covert and overt operations, Indonesia, Dominican Republic, Brazil, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and we can go on, and escalated the war on Black people in the cities. But what's interesting is that generation, by resisting liberalism, saw liberalism as a complete failure and then called for revolution, right? And so we can see that even in terms of the Obama years, where the intense resistance against deportations, is during the Obama years. Opposed to Obama's deporting 3 million people by a second term, that number had been reduced significantly because of resistance. 1/3 of people deported under Obama in the first term had no criminal records of the 3 million deported. And then the other thing is that, in terms of police violence, the same thing, the Obama years is kind of the insurgency, the upsurge of Black Lives Matter. And, it did make a difference. But what also made a difference, just like the Johnson years, is that people in these struggles realize that you cannot reform your way out of these things. It's a dead end. It's no accident that abolition takes off. It emerges, takes off during the Obama years, but during Trump years, of course, we could see it with spring 2020. But the last thing I just want to say is that, just a final point, and that is fascists and authoritarian regimes are always reactions or responses to mass movements. It's not the other way around. Working class insurgencies, the threat to capital, that's what gives rise to fascism. It's not like this some ambitious strong man hungry for power sitting around all brooding and somehow builds an arm. That just doesn't happen. And so if we remember that the reactions to our insurgencies, then it goes back to what Ellen said. We need to build, an insurgency and fight for the right for that insurgency to exist. And it will be very, very difficult, but not impossible.
Thank you again. And the third and last question, we should have probably flipped these questions, I'm thinking now, but oh well. Which parts of the current wave of repressive measures do you think are the most dangerous? And Robin, you're leading off.
Right. So, okay, it's a very hard question because parts make up a whole, so we're witnessing mass deportation, expanding police state, attack on organized labor, attack on education at all levels, attack on medical care, attack on the planet, on science, although they do back pseudoscience, namely eugenics, demolishing civil rights laws and institutions and agencies designed to address discrimination. And in fact, the elimination of DEIA not only criminalizes anti-racism and legalizes racism, but it is a Trojan horse for dismantling what's left of the regulatory state, an effort to restore and expand some form of apartheid, a direct assault on Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, trans, non-binary, and disabled people. And so that's what we're up against. I just want to kind of zero in on one thing, and this has to do with the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil by ICE. People know the story already. He was apparently he had his green card revoked. He may be in Louisiana. No one's really clear yet. But the fact that ICE agents could come on campus and arrest a student at will without a warrant prepares the way for extending its mass deportation plans aimed at anyone who's undocumented. And that's one huge thing. The administration's decision to withhold $400 million from Colombia because of its alleged anti-Semitism from an administration that's the most anti-Semitic, which is true, administration probably at least in the last 70, 80 years, right? These actions, all of them, portend a general attack, right, on all protests, on all academic freedom, on all funding streams, and on all migrants. So like, they're not going to give that money back to Colombia no matter what they do. They could bend over backwards, they'll never get it because it's not about that. So we have to address the elephant in the room, and that is that the Biden administration and the university administrators who are already moving in this direction, that's part of the problem. Don't forget, Mamadou Tall, the doctoral student at Cornell, threatened with deportation because the administration suspended him for protesting genocide in Gaza.